Gentlemen, welcome to this episode of the King's Hall podcast, joined by we three kings, not of Orient are. We have the Viking, Mr. Dan Burkholder.
Yes.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it, Eric.
You know what, Dan? It's good to have you. We also have Brian Sauvé.
It's good to be here, Eric.
The sweet psalmist of Ogden.
I would take. I'll take it. And you know what else we've got? We've got Eric Kahn, the sweet pugilist of Ogden. I don't know.
Rabble rouser.
Sweet might not be the word that some people would use to describe me.
Really, let's just say the sweetheart of Ogden.
Yeah, that's right. Brian, in this episode, obviously, we're going to deal with some weighty issues that have been going on in the Reformed camp. But first, we need to let our listeners know that the world is not just stuff.
It's definitely not just stuff. Confirmed. New book has, you can buy this right now. You can.
I think we're past, by the time this airs, we'll be past the get it for Christmas.
Yeah, it'll be a little bit after Christmas, but if you ordered it the day this came out. But I would still do it. I would head personally, if it was me, to newchristianpress.com/cosmos, and I would pick up Haunted Cosmos, Doing Your Duty in a World That's Not Just Stuff, so that I could learn about the taxonomy of God's seen and unseen world and how to do my duty in it. That's what I would. That's just one guy's opinion.
Guy's opinion. Can people still get a signed copy of the book?
Wow. If you ask really nicely and you buy a book, and then what I'll say is buy a book and then come to the New Christendom Press conference in June, bring it with you, and then probably, yeah.
Maybe I will sign the book.
Yeah.
Dan,
Eric will sign it for you.
This is one of your favorite books of all time. And you've read every sentence.
Here's what I will say about it. It is not turgid and pointless student term papers. It does not read that way.
Yeah, wow.
Thank you, Dan. High praise.
That is high praise.
It's not the worst thing ever written.
Well, gentlemen, as we jump into this discussion, obviously we had a slightly longer cold open than normal.
40 minutes longer.
We're aiming for the Haunted Cosmos length.
Yeah.
Writing from, Deacon Ben Garrett.
That's when Deacon Ben Garrett tells a story, he takes his time.
We looked at William F. Buckley Jr. and sort of what typically goes on in the conservative movement. Mark Twain said something I think is connected to this. He said, history doesn't repeat, but it does often rhyme. Do you guys still see this tendency on the right happening today? Gatekeeping the right. Dan, we'll start with you because your big brain and your brilliance.
Wow. Thank you, Eric. I know this is a serious conversation, so I take your compliments to heart.
Good.
Yes, absolutely. We still see the gatekeeping on the right. This has been a problem historically. You see this with the Buckley story that we told, but this has really been... especially in modern conservatism, which is kind of an ironic statement when you think about it. But in modern conservatism or in the modern conservatism movement, you see this gatekeeping is often detrimental to actually taking power and wielding it for the good of the people, to punish your enemies. But the left has no problem in doing that. And we've seen that especially highlighted since 2020, to where if you didn't do what the left said, then you would absolutely be punished. They would ruin you. They would end your career. You were labeled as a murderer for not taking certain substances inside your body or not wearing certain articles of clothing on your face. And so we see that in the left. They have no problem with wielding power to actually punish their enemies. And they even know how to use their radicals. Like Nancy Pelosi and AOC. Nancy Pelosi does not like AOC. From what I understand, I haven't had personal conversations with her, but you don't see her publicly criticizing AOC. The Green New Deal that AOC was a contributor for some years ago, you didn't see the Democrats, the leftists, come out and say, yeah, some of it's good, but most of it is complete garbage. I don't think the world is actually going to end because of methane gas from cattle, right? It was useful to them to push the Overton window. But on the right, it doesn't seem like we have the same stomach for utilizing power in the way that the left does. And so often you see that gatekeeping by taking the farthest right elements Some of them problematic, some of them actually really good and courageous men that are actually willing to push the Overton window, and instead the allure of the power and the money of the left, who holds most of the power in the media and in institutions and in the government and things like that. The allure is too much. And so instead of pushing the Overton window in the way that the left does, the right has determined, the soft middle right has determined that power and having a seat at the table is a worthy compromise than it is to push the Overton window and to actually gain power that you would actually wield against your opponents who are wicked, and to punish or to reward your friends. So yes, absolutely, that's still happening. It's an anomaly right now, particularly with the Trump administration, but we've even seen cracks of that with some of his more recent nominations for some of his cabinet, to where he seems to be throwing some bones back to the left. But that wasn't the case immediately when he was elected. So I don't know if you guys have seen the same thing or if you'd push back on any of that, but that's what I see.
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting, particularly like we reference Murray Rothbard, but even in the early 90s when he was describing the old right, so before the 1950s, it used to be not a monolith, but it was a very diverse group of thinkers. The things that they held in common were things you typically are the radical right now. So things like opposing FDR's New Deal, getting away from a welfare state. Actually, they were talking a lot about things like ending the Fed, getting back to some sort of like gold-based currency, stuff like that. But then over time, it was just, we're going to weed all those elements out. The 80s, really, Buckley opened the door for neoconservatism. And I think as a whole, Brian, it weakened the movement. It's interesting to me, though, as we've read the history and gone through it, you sort of, and I want to get your take on this, but I've sort of had this kind of recognition of like, wow, none of this stuff is actually new. And readers of scripture and people who love history, there's nothing new under the sun. We should really believe that. But just kind of how does it help us understand the moment looking back at the past in that way?
Yeah, we have to understand, like you said, history doesn't always repeat, but it does rhyme. When we look at, whether it's a large swath of history or the history of a nation or the history of some specific influential person all the way down to that, you'll often notice patterns that do repeat in other figures and movements, and you learn political tactics, and all of a sudden you say, oh, that was kind of Machiavellian before Machiavelli. That was, like you start to notice patterns. And it can be, there's a danger there where you can, all of a sudden you're a hammer that sees a nail everywhere. Like you discover something, you're like, oh, everything's driven by envy. And then lo and behold, everywhere I look, I see envy. It's right. All, there's a danger there as well. But in this particular case, with the story in the cold open and some of the background of the old right and the neocon movement, it's important not just for the patterns we see repeating today in terms of the left's playbook and how the left has successfully gotten the left to gatekeep the right and the right to gatekeep the right, while nobody gatekeeps the left. We also have to understand that this isn't just an old story that rhymes with current events, but current events are a continuation, another chapter in the same book.
Right.
So we're where we are today politically in the state of the right wing, the state of the left wing, because of this story. We're still in it, is another way of putting it. Like Pat Buchanan isn't ancient history.
No.
Pat Buchanan is like 2000s writing some of the most influential books on some of these subjects. And
Death of the West.
Yeah, Death of the West, which I'm reading right now. And it's making me want to reproduce just frankly irresponsibly.
That's great. Well, yeah, and one of the interesting things that I found in a lot of the research and talking to older guys who've been around this movement forever, things like the neoconservative movement is filled with really like Trotskyites. We mentioned this. Somebody asked me why on X I referred to the neoconservatives as the Trotskyite right. They were anti-Soviet, many of them, and many of them have like basically conversions, politically speaking. But it also helps frame something that's central to this story, which I think is, Buckley wanted to say, I never moved. And Gottfried essentially calls him out on that. He said, you did move. And all the people knew him best said, no, you did actually move. I think for all of us, just being aware that none of this is really static. Like the Dan from today is not the Dan from 10 years ago. So nobody, I think, actually honestly can say, I've never moved on anything. And certainly I think, Doug has said this before, but the fall of Big Eva and the embargo being lifted, situations change. And it seems like the wise thing, Dan, would be to recognize, okay, we always have to be going back and saying, what are my principles? Any of us could be tempted to change based on external circumstances. So how do you think through that in terms of maintaining principle in a world that is dynamic? It's changing.
Yeah, well, I think that it's really important. Something that we've had to discuss internally. As you get success, you have more opportunity, right? And so it's more important. Obviously, if you don't have success and there's not opportunity, your principles aren't really tested, because you can have your principles all to yourself and you don't really have any challenge to them. But as you gain more success and more opportunity, then your principles really are challenged, because there are going to be times when you're asked to sacrifice your principles, maybe for something that is sold to you as the greater good or something like that. But as soon as you lose your principles, you actually lose your distinctiveness, the thing that actually got you to where you are. And so that's one of the things that we all have to be aware of, is that as these opportunities come, that you actually maintain your principles. And it also tests your principles to make sure that they're the right principles, the right vision for the future. And so that's more of an ethereal comment, but it is actually quite important when you start applying it to what you do on a day-to-day basis. So if you look at, I'll just use us for an example. If you look at what we're doing, with the school and the church, New Christendom Press, there are other businesses that we're involved in, or businesses that our church members are starting or have success in. As more opportunities come, and you have, like, for example, maybe a bigger platform, you could actually have a show on some of the mainstream conservative platforms, but you just can't talk about X, Y, or Z, or you have to punch back at a X, Y, or Z. And make sure that you gatekeep, these people on your right, because they could be a real problem to your platform. Though that's where your principles are actually tested. And when you actually have to examine, what is my vision for the future? What does God say in his word? And what are the hills that I have to die on? And so these are some of the things that you definitely have to look at when you're moving, because you would hope that when you're moving, as you said, like the Dan of 10 years ago is not the Dan of today. That's 100% true. The Dan of 10 years ago didn't have any kids. The Dan of 10 years ago had to repent of not having any children. And so the way I view the world, the way I view the future, what I'm working for, everything that exists within me, not to make this all about me, but has actually changed to a degree. The foundational faith, my theological stances and things like that have remained relatively similar with some changes.
But I guess the hope would be that you're going deeper into your principles.
Exactly. Yep. Further up and further in. Exactly. Yep. And as you mature and as you grow and you get clarity, you sharpen your vision, you sharpen your principles to be a man that's actually unwavering in those principles, that will not bow to any pressure to waver on your principles, to capitulate, to the culture or to whomever is asking you to change. We talk about the leftist gaze, the allowable narrative, the things that you can talk about and the things you can't talk about. And why do those things exist? Well, a man of principle doesn't really care. A man of principle doesn't care what the leftists think, what their enemies perceive them as long as they're acting righteously, with that vision in mind, a biblical vision of the future. They should just build and just say, you know what? I don't have time to come down from the wall. The work is too great.